The 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was the result of many decades of hard work and lobbying from tireless suffragists who battled on both the state and national fronts, prohibits any US citizen from being denied the vote based on their sex. Nearly a half-century before this constitutional amendment was ratified, on August the 18th, 1920, activist Victoria Woodhull decided to run for the nation's highest office, announcing her candidacy on April the 2nd, 1871. Woodhull began life as Victoria Claflin in 1838 as the seventh of 10 children born to Roxana and Reuben Claflin. Despite what you might think from her later successes, including becoming the first female stockbroker on Wall Street, the young Victoria only had 3 years of formal education, occurring from the age of 8 to 11. She might have received more schooling had her father not intentionally burned down his own gristmill in order to collect on the insurance policy he had recently taken out on the building. It should also be mentioned here that her father's primary profession was as a con artist and snake oil salesman. His insurance fraud attempt was the last straw, and the town residents subsequently, quite literally, ran him out of town. As for his wife and children, so eager were the townspeople to get rid of the rest of the Claflins, they raised money for the family so they could afford a trip somewhere, anywhere else. After this, Victoria and her nearly as notable youngest sister, Tennessee Claflin, began helping to support the family as magnetic healers, clairvoyants, and fortune tellers. Unfortunately for Victoria, at the age of 14, one Dr. Canning Woodhull came into her life. 2 months after her 15th birthday, her parents married her off to that 28-year-old gentleman in November 1853. While contrary to popular belief, as we've covered before, such unions at such a young an age have never really been the norm. There were certainly many exceptions, though. Case in point, in situations regarding a relatively poor girl with few prospects where the man in question is reasonably well off or has a particularly bright future ahead, this sort of thing was not unheard of. After all, back then the vast majority of women's financial futures could only be secured via a husband. So finding a well-educated man to marry a poor, uneducated girl must have seemed a great match for ensuring her a reasonably comfortable life. It wasn't, at least not with Dr. Canning. Victoria's new husband proved to be an alcoholic and a womanizer, often leaving his family to live in squalor while he saved the financial fruits of his labor for himself and his many mistresses. Over the course of the next decade, the couple had 2 children, a severely mentally challenged son and a daughter. In a time when a woman divorcing a man for any reason was scandalous to the extreme and generally left the woman in question without a good way to support herself, Victoria bucked her first major societal trend and divorced Canning after 11 years of marriage. Despite that she despised her ex-husband, for reasons unclear today, she chose to keep his surname for the rest of her life, even after she married twice more in her lifetime, with the second husband even having a badass surname no less. As for that second husband, 2 years after her divorce, she married Civil War veteran Colonel James Blood of Missouri. Blood encouraged his new wife's free thinking and independence. He also helped her fight for equal rights, regardless of sex or race, and even supported Woodhull and her sister Tennessee in their desire to move to New York City together in 1868. New York proved to be a turning point in Victoria and Tennessee's lives. The sisters continued their work as mediums and alternative medicine peddlers, managing to attract the attention of the enormously wealthy Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was very interested in spiritualism at the time, hoping to connect with his deceased mother. He also had a general distrust of doctors, so the two ladies' methods of tending to the sick similarly appealed to him. It isn't clear exactly what the extent of the relationship between the sisters and Vanderbilt was, though it is thought that Tennessee became a serious love interest of his. Whatever the case, impressed with the pair's intelligence and drive, Vanderbilt became a silent backer to the sisters in their founding of Woodhull, Claflin and Company, bankers and brokers. The stock brokerage firm opened in early 1870, making the sisters the first female stockbrokers on Wall Street. The business thrived, and the pair were nicknamed the Queens of Finance in the press. This was a much more flattering nickname than Hetty Green got around the same time for her investing savvy, investing her fortune rather than working as a stockbroker. She was called the Witch of Wall Street. But in any event, the sisters' financial success in investing was enough that only a few months after they started their company, they were able to found Woodhull and Claflin's weekly newspaper. Beyond focusing on controversial ideas like promoting sex education, their publication also committed the triple taboo of the day of speaking out in support of equal rights and fair treatment regardless of race, sexual orientation, or sex. They even advocated for legalizing prostitution, of which it's estimated there were tens of thousands of such individuals plying the trade at that time in New York alone. Woodhull would also use the weekly for furthering her own candidacy for the office of US President, though she made her intentions known for such a presidential run in a letter published not in her weekly but in the New York Herald on April 2nd, 1871. In a letter to said publication, she wrote, "I claim the right to speak for the unenfranchised women of the country and announce myself as a candidate for the presidency. Some today contest that she can really be considered considered the first woman to run for president, as she was only 34 during her campaign and wouldn't have turned 35 until 6 months after the presidential inauguration, making her legally ineligible to run for office in the interim. However, while there were countless contemporary articles published about her presidential run, not a single one seems to have ever mentioned her age as a reason she shouldn't be president. Ignoring such an age-lowering government was not unprecedented. For example, famed politician Henry Clay was not yet the required age of 30 when he became a US senator. Despite this, nobody, even his opponents who could have used this fact to derail his election bid, ever used this against him, or even seemed to notice at all. In any event, Woodhull's presidential campaign platform included women's suffrage, the shortening of the workday and work week, and most controversially of all, free love. The basic idea on the latter point was that women, in her view, were nothing more than sexual slaves of little interest to many men of her age outside of how they could use them for sex and procreation. Many women didn't even have much of a say in who they ultimately married in the first place. She stated of this in a speech on November 20th, 1871, entitled The Principles of Social Freedom: "It is high time that your sisters and daughters should no longer be led to the altar like sheep to the shambles. The sexual relation must be rescued from this insidious form of slavery." She also noted, "To women, by nature, belongs the right of sexual determination. When the instinct is aroused in her, and then and only then should commerce follow. When woman rises from sexual slavery to sexual freedom into the ownership and control of her sexual organs, and man is obliged to respect this freedom, then will this instinct become pure and holy, then will women be raised from the iniquity and morbidness in which she now wallows for existence, and the intensity and glory of her creative functions be increased 100-fold. She felt that the key mechanism for this revolution was not just voting power, but a woman's right to be able to earn a living in what profession she chooses, thereby freeing her of her dependence on men. Women must rise from their position as ministers to the passions of men to be their equals. Their entire system of education must be changed. They must be trained like men to be permanent and independent individuals and not their mere appendages or adjuncts, with them forming but one member of society. They must be the companions of men from choice, never from necessity. She also quipped that women could easily and quickly achieve equal rights via a very simple plan. Let women issue a declaration of independence sexually and absolutely refuse to cohabit with men until they are acknowledged as equals in everything, and the victory would be won in a single week. On this note, at the core of her argument was a widespread societal double standard. She lamented that while men of the age were largely free to discreetly have mistresses or seek out prostitutes as desired without significant consequences in most cases, which she was completely fine with, a woman doing the same would be socially vilified and become an outcast, if not face much harsher consequences. That said, Woodhull herself would long claim to be a monogamist, although we might call her today a serial monogamist, and indeed advocated for monogamy in many of her writings and speeches. She simply thought monogamy was unrealistic for most marriages of the day that were full of miseries, and that women, not just men, should have the right not to be monogamous if they wanted, without threat of being ostracized by society. Thus, as a major part of her presidential platform, she advocated for a woman's right to have children, marry, divorce, and sleep with who they will, when they will, and just as importantly, have the socially acceptable right to not sleep with even their husbands if they chose to on any given day. Quote, "I have an inalienable constitutional and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, and with that right, neither you nor any law you can frame have any right to interfere." Given the provocative nature of her publication and her eloquent and compelling writing and speaking style, Woodhull quickly gained quite a following. Notably, a few months before she announced she'd be running for president, she even managed to secure herself an invitation to speak in front of the House Judiciary Committee, which she did on January the 11th, 1871, thanks to a friendship with Congressman Benjamin Butler from Massachusetts. At the time, no other woman in American history had ever testified in front of that governing body. Before the committee, she put forth the argument that women were already legally allowed to vote thanks to the 14th and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution, which, among other things, states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude," and, quoting again, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." She also likened women's plight at the time to that of Americans before the American Revolution, particularly with regards to taxation without representation. This was an argument she would later repeat in her famous Lincoln Hall speech on February 16, 1871, quoting, "I and others of my sex find ourselves controlled by a form of government in the inauguration of which we have no voice, and in whose administration we are denied the right to participate, though we are a large part of the people of this country. Was George III's rule, which he endeavoured to exercise over our fathers, less clearly an assumed rule than is this to which we are subjected? He exercised it over them, without their consent, and against their wish and will, and naturally they rebelled. Do men of the United States assume and exercise any less arbitrary rule over us than that was? No, not one whit the less. To be sure, his cabinet were few, while there are many, but the principle is the same. In both cases, the inherent elemental right to self-government is equally overridden by the assumption of power. But the authority King George's Parliament exercised was even more consistent than this which they assume and exercise. His government made no pretension to emancipation from the people. When our fathers launched taxation without representation as tyranny against King George, were they consistent? Certainly. Were they justified? Yes. Men fashioned a government based on their own enunciation of principles, that taxation without representation is tyranny, and that all just government exists by the consent of the governed. Proceeding upon these axioms, they formed a constitution declaring all persons to be citizens, that one of the rights of a citizen is the right to vote, and that no power within the nation shall either make or enforce laws interfering with the citizen's rights. And yet men deny women the first and greatest of all the rights of citizenship, the right to vote." End quote. Even though she failed to convince the committee, her oratory skills and rising influence brought significant national attention to suffrage, landing her on the radar of several prominent suffragettes, including Susan B. Anthony, who postponed the start of the National Women's Suffrage Association convention to listen to Woodhull speak. While the suffragists had strong reservations about Woodhull's background and the widespread perception that she was an inherently immoral individual due to her views on sex and divorce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at least initially, not so much later, felt this should be overlooked, writing in a letter dated April 15, 1871, "If all they say is true, Mrs. Woodhull is better than 9/10 of our fathers, husbands, sons, and women's purity amounts to little in the regeneration of the race as long as man is vile. Now, if our good men will only trouble themselves as much about the purity of their own sex as they do about ours, if they will make one moral code for men and women, we shall have a nobler type of manhood and womanhood in another generation than the world has yet seen." When our soldiers went to fight the battles of freedom of the late war, did they stop to inquire into the antecedents of everybody by their sides? The war would never have been finished if they had. Now, although I believe Mrs. Woodhull to be a grand woman, I should be glad to have her work for her own enfranchisement if she were not. I think she would become a better woman by thus working and by assuming all the rights, privileges, and amenities of an American citizen. With her star rising, Woodhull created the Equal Rights Party, which subsequently nominated her as their presidential candidate in May of 1872, and then ratified her nomination in June. They nominated the former slave and one of the truly remarkable individuals of American history, Frederick Douglass, as her vice president. Their platform was not just equal rights for women, but for all, and they hoped in nominating Douglass they could unite those fighting for black American rights and those fighting for women's rights. Unfortunately for them, other elements of Woodhull's platform were a little too controversial, and Douglass never responded to the nomination, instead campaigning for Ulysses S. Grant. While Woodhull was well aware that she had no chance of being elected in the first place, that was not the point of making the attempt. Her real goal was to establish a national platform with which to spread her then controversial ideas. Unfortunately for Woodhull, her campaign took something of a turn for the worse due to a tussle with famed advocate of evolution, as well as black and Chinese American rights, clergyman Henry Ward Beecher. Today, his sister Harriet Beecher Stowe is perhaps far more famous, but in his time, he was very well known and a popular minister throughout the country. Beecher advocated for many of the same controversial ideas as Woodhull. However, it was Woodhull's thoughts on free love, particularly that a woman should be allowed to divorce a man if she so choose and sleep with who she wants, that saw Beecher likening her to the devil and rallying against her from the pulpit. Cartoonist Thomas Nast would likewise depict Woodhull as the devil in a Harper's Weekly cartoon. The woman in said cartoon is depicted as the wife of an abusive drunk. But in response to Satan/Woodhull's seeming encouragement of the woman to divorce her husband, the woman states, "Get thee behind me, Mrs. Satan. I'd rather travel the hardest path of matrimony than follow your footsteps." Woodhull was no stranger to such criticism and ignored Nast's jab, but she found Beecher's condemnation particularly irksome. You see, Beecher, who wasn't exactly in the happiest of marriages for reasons separate from what what we're about to discuss, long had rumours swirling around him of having countless affairs and several mistresses throughout his adult life, with the joke being Beecher preaches to 7 or 8 of his mistresses every Sunday evening. Even the wife of Beecher's editor and patron, Henry Barn, would later confess to her husband on her deathbed that she'd once had an affair with Beecher. In another case, Ed and Dean Proctor, a woman who helped Beecher write a book on his sermons, would claim Beecher raped her, although Beecher would state that this wasn't true and that the encounter in question was consensual. Whatever the case, the pair allegedly continued on in the affair for about a year. So when Woodhull learned from Elizabeth Cady Stanton that a friend of Beecher's, Theodore Tilton, had confided in her that Beecher was having a long-standing affair with his wife, Elizabeth Tilton, Woodhull decided to respond to Beecher's barrage of criticism sent to her by letting the public know of his extramarital activities in her newspaper. In the article, Woodhull explicitly stated she was happy for Beecher for his sexual freedom and didn't judge him in the slightest for his numerous affairs, but what angered her was that he should practice a part of the free love she advocated, but then condemn her for promoting the idea that this exact behaviour should be legally and socially acceptable for both men and women. As she summed up in her expose, the Beecher-Tilton scandal case, published November 2nd, 1872, "I am not charging him with immorality. I applaud his enlightened views. I am charging him with hypocrisy." This did not work out for her. Beecher's many supporters went after her with a vengeance, including self-proclaimed weeder in God's garden Anthony Comstock of the soon-to-be enacted Comstock law fame, having her arrested for sending an utter obscene publication through the US mail. Thus, on the day of voting for individuals who in turn actually vote for the president, again the general public does not vote for the president on election day, but for a group of electors, nor is the president elected until much later, contrary to popular belief, Woodhull, Tennessee, and Colonel Blood found themselves sitting in a cell in the Ludlow Street jail. While she was in jail for reasons unclear, her name did not appear on any state ballots, and she supposedly received 0 popular votes for her electorates. However, this was later proved to be false, and it is known that at least some individuals wrote in her name. These votes simply weren't counted. As for Beecher, he was soon at the epicenter of one of the most talked about lawsuits of the age, when his former friend, the aforementioned Theodore Tilton, sued him for alienation of affection due to the affair Beecher had with Tilton's wife. The ultimate result was a hung jury and Tilton, not Beecher, being excommunicated from the Plymouth Church. In any event, while the vast majority of her contemporaries didn't agree with Woodhull's idea on free love particularly, her arrest was a bit of an outrage to some journalists who in turn rallied against what essentially amounted to censorship of the media. 1 month later, Woodhull would be released from jail, and 5 months after that, she'd be cleared of all charges. But the damage had been done. Thanks to her public revelation of Beecher's hypocrisy, promotion of taboo ideas, and her presidential campaign, which was largely panned as just her seeking attention for herself, she'd not only managed to make an enemy of Beecher's countless supporters nationwide, but also alienated the women's suffragist movement to boot. This was an organization she'd always been something of an outsider in any way, given many of the other leaders of said organization tended to be upper middle class to wealthy, well-educated women, while Woodhull was a formerly impoverished spiritualist and snake oil salesman with little formal education. Ultimately, they turned on her, with Susan B. Anthony publicly describing Woodhull and her sister as lewd and indecent. In fact, while Woodhull played a relatively significant role in the early days of said movement, when the history of the women's suffrage movement, written by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, was published in the late 1880s, they saw to it that Woodhull's contributions were left out of this so-called comprehensive history. Harriet Beecher Stowe, likewise, besides directly denouncing Woodhull, calling her an impudent witch and a vile jailbird, even took shots at her in one of her works, My Wife and I. "Well," said I, "why not a woman president as well as a woman queen of England? Because," said he, "look at the difference. The woman queen in England comes to it quietly. She is born to it, and there is no fuss about it. But whoever is set to be president of the United States is just set up to have his character torn off from his back in shreds and to be mauled, pummeled, and covered with dirt by every filthy paper all over the country. And no woman that was not willing to be dragged through every kennel and slopped into every dirty pail of water like an old mop would ever consent to run as a candidate. Why, it's an ordeal that kills a man, and what sort of a brazen tramp of a woman would it be that could stand it and come out of it without being killed? Would it be any kind of woman we should want to see at the head of our government? I tell you, it's quite another thing to be president of a democratic republic from what it is to be hereditary queen." "Good for you, Papa," said Eva, clapping her hands. "Why, how you go on. I never did hear such eloquence. No, Ida, set your mind at rest. You shan't be run for President of the United States. You are a great deal too good for that." Beyond this, in Chapter 5, Beecher Stowe vilifies a character known as Miss Audacia Danger Eyes. Woodhull reportedly had strikingly blue eyes, who had a paper that advocated against Christianity, marriage, the family state, and all human laws and standing order. While Beecher Stowe would become an enemy of Woodhull's over the expose on Stowe's brother, Beecher's other sister, Isabella, was an ardent supporter of Woodhull, including Woodhull's condemnation of her brother's hypocrisy concerning his affairs. This later led to widespread rumours that Woodhull had used witchcraft to bewitch Isabella. In the time since, some historians have even speculated Isabella and Woodhull were lovers, but there is no evidence whatsoever to support that notion. As for the aftermath of the election, the controversy not only negatively impacted Woodhull's social life, resulting in her family being continually harassed, but also put a damper on her financial situation. Once relatively wealthy thanks to her business dealings, successful publication, and countless speaking gigs, Woodhull now found herself with limited funds and largely boycotted. This included being evicted from her home and having difficulty finding any landlord in Manhattan that would rent to her. Eventually, fed up with it all and the lack of progress in the fight for equal rights, in 1877, shortly after the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt, a few months after divorcing James Blood, Woodhull and Tennessee took their remaining funds, rumor has it, along with some amount to be paid to the sisters by William Vanderbilt, in exchange for the pair not publicly revealing anything about his recently deceased father's private life, and they moved to London. Once there, Woodhull began popularly lecturing, as before, on equal rights for all and free love. Notably, during one of her presentations on the human body, the Temple of God, she drew the attention of a very wealthy banker in one of her audiences, John Biddulph Martin. 6 years later, on October the 31st, 1883, he became her third husband, despite the strong objections of his family. She remained married to him for the rest of his life, with Martin dying 18 years later in 1901. Among other activities in her later life, Woodhull briefly returned to the United States to attempt to secure another presidential nomination in both 1884 and 1892, failing both times, though the 1884 instance is notable that it is the very first time two women vied for the presidency. From 1892 to 1901, she published the magazine The Humanitarian with the help of her daughter. She also funded a school of agriculture, which quickly failed, and during World War I volunteered with the Red Cross. After her third husband's death in 1901, Woodhull ceased publishing her magazine and retired to a small village in Worcestershire, Bredons Norton, where she lived to the ripe old age of 88, dying in 1927. As for the summation of her life's work, Woodhull once stated, "While others prayed for the good time coming, I worked for it." And if you're wondering whatever happened to Woodhull's sister, Tennessee, who incidentally, besides everything already mentioned, once ran for Congress, fought for women's right to serve in the military, and was named a colonel of a Black National Guard regiment, after her move to London, she married the Viscount of Montserrat, Sir Francis Cook. Within a year of their marriage, Sir Cook would also become an English baronet by decree of Queen Victoria. The pair would remain married until his death in 1901. Tennessee died in 1923. And now for some bonus facts. Bella Ann Lockwood, the first woman to be granted the right to practice law in the US after she petitioned Congress concerning this, would also run for president in 1884 and then again in 1888, becoming the second woman to do so and the first to actually appear on official election ballots. Though she ran a much less controversial campaign than Woodhull, she was likewise largely vilified in the media. She also claimed most of the votes for her electorates were not counted, and that the Pennsylvania, if not other state vetoes in her favor, were simply dumped into the wastebasket as false votes. Despite her petitioning Congress over this voter fraud in 1885, they did not choose to have the matter looked into further. Moving on from there, we have the first female presidential candidate from a major party. On January the 27th, 1964, then three-term Senator Margaret Chase Smith put the first crack in the highest glass ceiling when she announced her candidacy for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Senator Smith was born on December the 14th, 1897 in Skowhegan, Maine, to working-class parents George Emery and Carrie Matilda Chase. Margaret attended public school, played on the basketball team, and graduated in 1916. Over the next decade, Margaret held several jobs including school teacher, business officer, and treasurer. In 1922, she helped found the local chapter of the Business and Professional Women's Club in Skowhegan, and by 1926, she was president of the statewide group. After she married Clyde Smith, a local politician, in 1930, Margaret developed political ambitions and shortly thereafter was elected to the Maine Republican State Committee. In 1937, Clyde Smith was elected to represent Maine's 2nd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, and Margaret went with him to Washington, D.C., where she worked as his secretary, office manager, and speechwriter. Clyde suffered a fatal heart attack in the spring of 1940, but before he died, he encouraged Margaret to run for his seat in the next election. She won the special election unopposed, and shortly thereafter, the general election by a large margin. Representative Chase Smith was re-elected to the House in 1942, 1944, and 1946. During her tenure as a member of the Naval Affairs Committee, she toured the South Pacific during World War II and was a strong supporter of women in the military. She also served as the chair of the Subcommittee on Hospitalization and Medicine and used that clout to pass the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. An independent thinker, Representative Chase Smith supported several democratic policies and legislation, including the Selective Service Act, some New Deal programs, and President Truman's foreign policy. She also broke ranks with her Republican colleagues from time to time and opposed the strike and union-busting Smith-Connolly Act in 1943. Unlike her position in the House, which she first obtained, at least in part from her husband's passing, Margaret's ascension to the Senate was entirely her own doing. Facing entrenched Republican Party favorites in the primary and having very little campaign money, Margaret ran on her Washington, D.C. experience with the slogan, "Don't change a record for a promise." During the campaign, some questioned whether a woman had the right to qualify as a senator, to which Republican Chase Smith replied, "Women administer the home, they set the rules, enforce them, mete out justice for violations. Thus, like Congress, they legislate. It is an ideal experience for politics." Margaret won that Republican primary and went on to defeat her Democratic opponent in the general election by a wide margin. By winning the Senate seat, she became the first woman to serve in both the House and the Senate. On June 1, 1950, in response to the calumny being spread by Senator Joseph McCarthy, the fear it engendered, and the deleterious effect it had on freedom of speech, Senator Chase Smith delivered a courageous address from the Senate floor, describing the then current situation as, quote, "a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it is not exercised by others." The speech ended with a declaration of conscience that decried the selfish political exploitation of fear, bigotry, ignorance, and intolerance being practiced by a few of her fellow Republicans, including McCarthy. Several other Republican senators joined her declaration, and later Senator McCarthy would refer to them collectively as Snow White and the Six Dwarfs. However, many others were impressed with the speech, including individual citizens, newspaper editorial boards, civic organizations, and even President Harry Truman, who referred to the declaration as one of the finest things that has happened in Washington in all my years. Senator Chase Smith easily won re-election in 1954, 1960, and 1966. Notably, in the 1960 general election, the senator defeated Lucia Cormier, making the 1960 run for the first all-female campaign for a Senate seat in American history. In 1950, she was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve, a post she served through 1958. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Chase Smith was a hawk, advocating for the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union and supporting the Vietnam War. She was also a strong supporter of education, civil rights, and Medicare and the space program, the latter of which, contrary to popular belief, was not supported by the majority of American citizens. In fact, according to Smithsonian space historian Roger Lanius, during the early days of the Apollo missions, the US space program was one of the top government programs Americans listed that they thought should be dropped, with a full 60% of Americans feeling that the US was spending too much money on spaceflight. Despite her earlier popularity, Senator Chase Smith lost her 1972 re-election bid. As for her bid to become the first female presidential candidate from a major party, Senator Chase Smith struggled with the decision to enter the 1964 campaign for the Republican nomination for president, but ultimately decided to run, noting, "I have few illusions and no money, but I'm staying to the finish." During her speech to the Women's National Press Club in Washington, D.C. on January 24, 1964, she stated she decided to run for several reasons, including that she had the most experience of any candidate, many wanted her independent voice in the campaign, and to destroy any political bigotry against women by, quote, "pioneering the way for a woman in the future to make her more acceptable, to make the way easier for her to be elected President of the United States." Nonetheless, Senator Smith's lack of staff, funding, and political backing led to a generally poor showing in the primaries, although she surprised everyone by taking 25% of the votes in Illinois. At the Republican convention, her name was put in for nomination, and she received 27 delegates. She refused to relinquish her delegates, and as a result, she took second in the balloting, losing to Barry Goldwater by a wide margin. Goldwater would ultimately lose the presidential election by a landslide to Lyndon B. Johnson. After losing the 1972 Senate election, Margaret toured the country, lecturing at various colleges and universities for the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. She later returned to Skowhegan, where she installed the Margaret Chase Smith Library Center. Senator Chase Smith received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from George H.W. Bush in 1989, and she died on May 29, 1995.